At 9:17 a.m., the Federation's ambassador to the Southern Republic delivered diplomatic note 447 Alpha to the Republic's foreign ministry. The note contained an ultimatum. Minister Viktor Melanov, the Republic's Interior Security Minister, must resign from office within 72 hours or the Federation will impose comprehensive economic sanctions, freeze all Melanov-associated assets under Federation jurisdiction, and ban travel to Federation territory for Melanov and immediate family members. The note cited Melanov's alleged role in authorizing excessive force against civilian protesters during demonstrations 3 months ago, resulting in 43 deaths and over 200 injuries. The note stated that Melanov's continued service in government is incompatible with international human rights norms and that his resignation is necessary for restoration of normal bilateral relations. At 9:34 a.m., the Republic's foreign minister rejected the ultimatum as an unacceptable violation of national sovereignty and stated that the Federation has no authority to demand the removal of democratically appointed officials of a sovereign nation. Subscribe to this channel immediately, because what you are witnessing is not a diplomatic dispute. This is an ultimatum from a major power demanding a sovereign nation remove a high-ranking government official within 72 hours. This is the target nation refusing compliance and invoking sovereignty. This is the question of whether international pressure can compel internal government changes and what enforcement mechanisms exist when ultimatums are defied. Turn on notifications, because the next 72 hours will determine whether the Federation's deadline triggers actual consequences, whether the Southern Republic's government fractures under pressure, whether international law permits one nation to dictate another's cabinet composition, and whether ultimatum diplomacy still functions in an era where sovereignty claims can block external coercion. Here is what led to this moment. 3 months ago, the Southern Republic experienced its largest protests in a decade, demanding economic reforms and political freedoms. On the 15th day, protesters occupied the Central Plaza. Interior Security Minister Viktor Melanov authorized security forces to clear the plaza. What happened next is disputed. Government sources claim protesters attacked security personnel. Independent observers reported security forces used live ammunition against unarmed civilians, resulting in 43 deaths and over 200 injuries. The Republic's internal investigation concluded force was proportional. International human rights organizations rejected that finding and called for Melanov's prosecution. But here is where it shifted. 6 weeks ago, the Federation's Congress held hearings on the crackdown. The Congress passed a resolution 387 to 143 declaring Melanov bears personal responsibility and calling for action. 4 weeks ago, the Federation announced targeted sanctions against 12 Republic officials, including Melanov, freezing assets and banning travel. The Republic condemned this as interference 2 weeks ago. The Federation's Secretary of State stated Melanov's continued presence prevents normalization of relations. At 3:47 p.m. yesterday, the Federation's National Security Council discussed next steps. The Secretary of State argued sanctions alone were insufficient. The Defense Secretary expressed concerns about precedent. At 7:23 p.m., the executive signed Authorization Directive 29, Gamma instructing the ambassador to deliver an ultimatum demanding Melanov's resignation within 72 hours. Now watch what happens next. At 9:17 a.m. this morning, the ambassador delivered diplomatic note 447 Alpha. The note specified the 72 hard deadline, outlined the consequences of noncompliance, and stated that the Federation views Melanov's resignation as essential for bilateral relations. At 9:34 a.m., the Southern Republic's foreign minister issued immediate response. Quote, "The Federation's ultimatum is a gross violation of our national sovereignty. No foreign power has authority to demand the resignation of officials appointed by our government. Minister Melanov serves at the pleasure of our executive and legislature, not at the direction of external actors. This ultimatum will not be honored." At 10:12 a.m., Minister Melanov held a press conference. Quote, "I will not resign under foreign pressure. I was appointed to protect our nation's security and maintain public order. I fulfilled that duty during the protests. The Federation's characterization of legitimate security operations as human rights violations is propaganda designed to undermine our government. I remain committed to serving our nation and will not be intimidated by external threats." At 10:47 a.m., the Southern Republic's executive issued a statement supporting Melanov. Quote, "Minister Melanov has our full confidence." The Federation's attempt to dictate our government composition through ultimatums is unacceptable. We reject this coercive diplomacy and reaffirm our sovereignty. Drop a comment right now. Tell me whether the Federation has the right to demand another nation's official resign, or whether this constitutes unacceptable interference in sovereign affairs. I am reading every response. This is the question national legal scholars, allied governments, and the Southern Republic's own political opposition are debating at this moment. At 11:34 a.m., the Federation's Secretary of State responded to the rejection. Quote, "The Southern Republic has 72 hours from delivery of our note to comply. That deadline is not negotiable. If Minister Melanov remains in office after the deadline, the consequences outlined in our note will be implemented immediately. We urge the Republic's leadership to make the right choice." At 12:17 p.m., allied governments began issuing positions. 3 supported the Federation's ultimatum on human rights grounds. 4 expressed concern about the ultimatum approach undermining sovereignty norms. 2 took neutral positions calling for dialogue through international legal mechanisms. At 1:04 p.m., the Southern Republic's legislature convened emergency session. The opposition coalition, which holds 43% of seats, introduced a motion calling on Melanov to resign in the national interest to avoid economic sanctions. The governing coalition, holding 57%, introduced counter-motion condemning the Federation's ultimatum as interference and expressing full support for Melanov. At 2:34 p.m., the legislature voted. The support motion passed 57 to 43 along party lines. The Republic's legislature officially backed Melanov and rejected the ultimatum. Subscribe now if you have not already, because what I am about to show you is how ultimatum diplomacy fractures when sovereign refusal meets enforcement uncertainty. At 3:12 p.m., the Federation's Treasury Department announced it was preparing comprehensive sanctions packages to be implemented immediately upon deadline expiration. The packages include freezing all Southern Republic government assets held in Federation financial institutions, banning Federation companies from doing business with Republic state enterprises, and imposing travel restrictions on all current cabinet members. At 3:47 p.m., the Southern Republic's finance minister warned that such sanctions would cause severe economic harm to both nations given extensive bilateral trade relationships. At 4:23 p.m., the Southern Republic's political opposition held press conference. The opposition leader stated that while the ultimatum format is problematic, Melanov's presence in government damages the nation's international standing and economic prospects. The leader called on Melanov to resign voluntarily to serve national interests, framing it as Melanov's choice rather than foreign coercion. At 4:41 p.m., Melanov rejected that appeal, stating he will not resign under any pressure, whether foreign or domestic. There is a detail most people missed. International law recognizes sovereignty as a foundational principle. The Charter of the United Nations and customary international law prohibit interference in domestic affairs of sovereign states. However, international human rights law creates obligations for states to prevent and punish human rights violations. The tension is whether external pressure for accountability constitutes legitimate human rights enforcement or illegitimate sovereignty violation. The Federation argues that demanding Melanov's resignation is not interference, but rather appropriate response to documented violations. The Southern Republic argues that no matter how framed, external demands for official removal violate sovereignty. There is no international court with jurisdiction to resolve this dispute because both principles, sovereignty and human rights accountability, are recognized in international law, but their interaction in ultimatum scenarios has never been definitively adjudicated. At 5:34 p.m., the International Human Rights Council acknowledged allegations against Melanov, but expressed concern that unilateral ultimatums may not be consistent with sovereignty principles. At 6:12 p.m., the Continental Alliance called for mediation. The Democratic Nations Forum supported the Federation. The Sovereignty Coalition condemned the ultimatum as dangerous precedent. At 6:47 p.m., the Federation's executive addressed the nation, quote, "We gave the Southern Republic a clear choice. Remove an official responsible for killing peaceful protesters or face consequences. This is not about interfering in their government. This is about holding accountable those who violate fundamental human rights. Our deadline stands. Minister Melanov must resign within the specified time or we will act. At 7:14 p.m. The Southern Republic's executive also addressed the nation, quote, "No sovereign nation can accept foreign dictation of who serves in our government. If we comply with this ultimatum, we surrender our independence. We will not do so. We stand with Minister Melanov, not because we approve of every action taken during the protests, but because we will not allow external powers to choose our officials." This is the moment it stopped being a bilateral dispute and became a test of ultimatum diplomacy. At 8:03 p.m., the Federation's intelligence service reported the Republic's government is divided. 3 cabinet ministers privately support Melanov's resignation to avoid sanctions, while 5 oppose compliance. The executive is reportedly weighing economic costs against political principles at 8:34 p.m. The Federation confirms sanctions are ready for implementation. Now 57 hours away, at 9:17 p.m., the Republic's opposition organized demonstrations calling for Melanov's resignation. Thousands gathered in major cities at 9:52 p.m. Melanov responded he will not resign due to street pressure. Here are the indicators we are watching as the deadline approaches. Does Melanov resign voluntarily? Does the Republic's executive pressure Melanov? Does the government propose compromise? Does the Federation extend the deadline? Do allied nations broker mediation? Does the governing coalition fracture? Does public pressure make Melanov's position untenable? Here are the 3 scenarios. Scenario 1. Melanov resigns before deadline. Facing economic catastrophe, internal political pressure, and international isolation, Melanov announces resignation, framed as serving national interests rather than bowing to external pressure. The Federation accepts the resignation as compliance. Sanctions are not implemented. Bilateral relations gradually normalize, but the precedent is set that ultimatums can work if economic costs are high enough. This is the compliance scenario. Scenario 2, deadline passes without resignation, and sanctions are implemented. The Federation imposes all threatened measures. The Southern Republic's economy suffers, but the government does not force Melanov out. Relations deteriorate. Both nations bear costs. Melanov remains in office as symbol of sovereignty resistance. The standoff continues indefinitely with neither side backing down. This is the stalemate scenario. Scenario 3. The ultimatum fails and the Federation backs down. Deadline passes. The Republic refuses compliance, and the Federation implements partial sanctions, but not the comprehensive measures threatened. The ultimatum is revealed as bluff. The Federation's credibility is damaged. Other nations conclude that sovereignty refusal can defeat ultimatum diplomacy. Melanov remains in office stronger than before. This is the backfire scenario. International ultimatum diplomacy has been employed dozens of times. Most involve territorial disputes or military actions. Ultimatums demanding removal of specific officials are rare and usually target small or economically dependent nations. This case is unusual because the Southern Republic has sufficient international support to sustain resistance. What I know for certain right now, at 9:17 a.m., the Federation delivered ultimatum demanding Melanov's resignation within 72 hours. At 9:34 a.m., the Southern Republic rejected it as sovereignty violation. At 10:12 a.m., Melanov refused to resign. At 10:47 a.m., the Republic's executive backed Melanov. At 2:34 p.m., the legislature voted support for Melanov. At 3:12 p.m., the Federation confirmed sanctions are ready. At 7:14 p.m., the Republic's executive stated compliance would surrender independence. 57 hours remain until deadline. The Federation has issued clear demands with specific timeline. The Southern Republic has categorically refused. Allied nations are divided. Internal Republic politics are fractured. Sanctions are prepared. And there is no international legal mechanism for determining whether ultimatum compliance is required, recommended, or prohibited under sovereignty and human rights principles. The question is whether economic coercion can override sovereignty when the coercing power frames demands as human rights accountability at 9:47 p.m. The Federation Diplomatic Archives recorded the following entry. Ultimatum note, 4:47. Alpha delivered 9:17 hours demanding official resignation within 72. Poor deadline. Recipient nation rejected as sovereignty violation. Compliance refused. Sanctions implementation pending deadline expiration. International law status of coercive personnel removal demands unresolved. And whether the next entry records compliance through resignation, standoff through sanctions implementation, or retreat through non-enforcement will determine whether ultimatum diplomacy remains viable when sovereignty and accountability principles collide with neither legal framework providing clear resolution